Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, you can start.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to share this research. The reason I wanted to do it with a presentation is because I'll be discussing some concepts that you may or may not be familiar with, and they're very important concepts to the whole debate about what happened in Jammu and Kashmir in 2019. So I'm talking about a study titled A Forced Union, exploring the consequences of India's removal of Jammu and Kashmir's special status. And it explores the profound impacts of India's actions within Jammu and Kashmir, which I'll simply refer to as J&K. And I do this through the lens of a qualitative study that incorporated civilian accounts and legal amendments made immediately after the removal of J&K's special autonomous status. So some of those key concepts that I'll be talking about are demographic engineering, ethnic conflict, Hindu nationalism, and the plight of religious minorities. And if you can go to the second slide, please. So, just in terms of an introduction to the context of Jammu and Kashmir, it's essential to understand the unique historical and political context of the state. Since 1947, J&K has been part of an international territorial dispute. To protect the rights of its indigenous populations during this period, Articles 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution were enacted. And these articles were vital as they strictly defined who was considered a legal citizen, or what we referred to as a state subject, allowing only these individuals to obtain permanent residency, to own property, to vote in J&K elections, to hold political office, or to be part of the civil service, for example. Furthermore, Article 370 granted the J&K Constituent Assembly decision-making powers over its own internal affairs. So that meant that India couldn't make decisions domestically within J&K. However, on August 5th, as many of you may know, 2019, this special autonomous status was unilaterally revoked by the Indian government and its ruling BJP party. And the days leading up to the announcement were marked by significant military build-up within Jammu and Kashmir, the arrest of all democratically elected politicians, and the disarming of local police. There was a strict curfew and a complete communication blackout. So it meant no internet, telephone signals, everything was completely closed off. So the way that it was executed, both legally and in literal terms, essentially accounts to what we would consider an annexation. And sorry, the third slide, please. So I was interested in exploring this as an academic and someone who has been watching developments in Kashmir for some time. And I did this primarily to understand how the people of Jammu and Kashmir themselves perceived the revocation of their special status, because Indian media were at the time reporting that there was normalcy in Kashmir, that everything was okay, even though, of course, we couldn't communicate with people inside the state. This was the narrative that was being presented. So this study essentially set out to ask two questions. Firstly, can the new post-abrogation residency laws and boundary changes in Jammu and Kashmir be interpreted as a form of demographic engineering? So in other words, was this a deliberate attempt by the BJP government to change the demographic makeup within Jammu and Kashmir, which was the only remaining Muslim majority state? And secondly, what do the empirical findings from the study gathered from the ground tell us about the lived experiences and the perceptions of these demographic engineering agendas? And to answer that, of course, I'm an academic, so I'm always told to look at the existing theory on these things. I used a framework which was devised by somebody called Morland, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I used that to demonstrate that this was indeed a form of demographic engineering. So if we go to the fourth slide, please. So what is demographic engineering? At its core, it refers to an intentional government policy designed to change the population's characteristics, specifically to reduce the power, decision-making abilities, and political influence of certain groups within a territory. And it's a concept within political demography, which studies how states employ strategies to alter either the size, composition, or distribution of populations to achieve particular political goals. And this often translates into deliberate efforts to change the ethnic or religious makeup of a region to gain greater political control over that particular population. So if we go to slide 5, please. So some of these you'll sort of be familiar with just in terms of lexicon that you'll hear on the news or within media. So Morland essentially categorized these in two ways. So we're very familiar with what he called hard demographic engineering, which is things like genocide and ethnic cleansing. Of course, if you kill populations or you drive them out of territories, we can understand how that would change the demography of an area. But he also talked about soft demographic engineering. So these are more subtle. And these aim to essentially strengthen the demographic position of one group while weakening the other. So this can include redefining territorial boundaries in order for sort of what some scholars call ethnic consolidation, where preferred populations are encouraged to increase either through economic incentives. So, for example, encouraging people to migrate into a territory through economic incentives, or making it easier for certain populations to gain residency within a territory. Other soft strategies are, for example, encouraging certain populations to have more children. So through fertility measures, we've seen that in Israel, for example, there've been sort of a lot of investment into Israeli populations to have more children, to sort of even out or even eventually overtake the Palestinian population. But there's also things around changing political boundaries within an area so that some groups then, just by virtue of changing a boundary, become a majority within a particular space within the region. So there are all manner of ways at which governments have attempted to do this. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So within Jammu and Kashmir, for example, when I first started looking at this as a framework, I was quite surprised to see that there had been previous attempts of altering the population that actually fit within this concept. So the first one, perhaps the most stark, was something known as the Jammu massacre, which you may or may not have heard of. It was a horrific event. It happened towards the end of 1947, so post-partition. I mean, we're talking around October 1947, where there was a deliberate move on the part of the then Maharaja, the Dogra Raj, the Hindu ruling elite of Jammu and Kashmir, to essentially kill as many Muslims in the Jammu province as possible. And we know that within just a few short weeks, Muslims went from 60% to 40%. So there was this huge number of deaths that were reported. And that is, of course, what we would think of as hard demographic engineering, literally exterminating people who belong to a certain group. So that pushed the number of Muslims or the proportion of Muslims in Jammu down quite significantly. And then we see another example of this, and this is kind of debatable. Some people have said, no, it's not really demographic engineering, but what we do know is that in the 90s, the very small population of Hindus in Kashmir, known as Hindu Pandits, left. This was mainly due to militancy. So there was militancy, Muslim militant groups that had begun to take hold within Kashmir, and many of these Kashmiri Pandits decided that it wasn't safe for them anymore, and they felt that they had to leave. Now, from their perspective, that was deliberate. They felt that they were being targeted and that the only way that they could remain safe was to leave. And then we've actually seen it within Pakistani-controlled territory as well. So within Gilgit-Baltistan, for example, Pakistan dismantled the residency rights that we had. So remember I talked about the state subject rule where only people from the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, which includes Gilgit-Baltistan, only they were allowed to own property. Well, Pakistan actually dismantled that within Gilgit-Baltistan. And some argue that this is because Gilgit-Baltistan had a significant Shia population, and actually by dismantling it, it allowed more Sunnis from neighboring Khyber Pakhtunkhwa to move into GB, and that did actually eventually alter the proportion of Sunni Shia. So again, we could argue that this was also a form of demographic engineering, whatever the motivation was. And then another example that's been highlighted within some of the literature, of course, is whether intentional or not intentional, is the mass displacement from Azad Kashmir as a result of the Mangla Dam. So we know that approximately 50% of that population who are affected now live overseas. So the point is that there have already been quite significant demographic shifts as a result of one policy or another within the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A, their immediate impact, it wasn't just a political move. I mean, it fundamentally dismantled all the legal protections for people who lived in Kashmir that had been previously put in place. So now all of those land ownership laws were completely eradicated, and all of Indian laws had now been moved, essentially were now relevant within Jammu and Kashmir. That hadn't been the case before. So New Delhi was now directly ruling Jammu and Kashmir. And all the Indian laws had now been made applicable to Jammu and Kashmir. And J&K's own laws had now essentially all been removed or revoked. And it was also downgraded from a state to two union territories, which again meant that these are now part of the Indian Union formally. It's not even its own state anymore. So, many were sort of talking about the fact that this was initially when people were sort of opposing this, they were saying that this was absolutely because India wanted greater control over the remaining Muslim state within its sort of, territorial space. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the methodology of the study, well, it was quite difficult given that there was a complete communication blackout for me to communicate with people. But I managed still. So I took two approaches to do that. Firstly, I was very lucky to have research assistants on the ground. So there was a student from the Kashmir Valley who was doing his PhD in Delhi. There was also a teacher who is from a Hindu Bahari background who was based in Jammu but is from Rajouri. They conducted interviews for me on the ground. I also then was able to speak to some people who were still inside J&K. So if you worked as a civil servant, for example, or you worked in a school or a university, you could access Wi-Fi at at your place of work. It was obviously very risky for them to do so, but they did do so. So I had conversations with people on WhatsApp. So in total, we conducted 52 interviews with people from various communities inside Jammu and Kashmir. And I won't go into this in too much detail, but in Pakistan, when people talk about Kashmir, it's very odd. It's not the same case on the Indian side, but Kashmir is, Jammu and Kashmir isn't just the Kashmir Valley. It's a very diverse ethno-linguistic state with, various religions. Of course, Muslims are the majority, but there are still Kashmiri Sikhs. And there are also large ethno-linguistic communities who are not from the Kashmir Valley. So these are Baharis, ethnic Baharis, and ethnic Baharis are essentially the majority of the population of Azad Kashmir as well. So we are the same ethnic group as the people on the other side immediately on the other side of the LOC in places like Poonch and Rajouri, which fall under the Jammu province in whole. But just to say that I was very mindful of the fact that I wanted to speak to people, I wanted to engage with people from both the Jammu and the Kashmir province. So that was done quite successfully. If we move on to the next slide, I'll kind of start talking about some of the findings. So changes to populations due to it being a disputed state as well. All of the respondents could understand this. So there was generally agreement that whether you were a Hindu in Jammu and Kashmir, and there were very few Hindus that we interviewed, but nevertheless, we did interview some. But there was definitely an understanding that India had revoked the special status of Jammu and Kashmir because it was a disputed status. And in a way, it was kind of the last remaining thorn in the side for the BJP. Because if there ever had been a referendum, a plebiscite, um, that Muslim majority population could, of course, vote to leave being part or having any kind of territorial relationship with India. So this seemed to be very much sort of accepted as a rationale for why um, the BJP did this. And if we go to the next slide, please. And then others talked about the fact that this was what they refer to as a homogenizing effort on the part of the BJP because they are a right-wing Hindu nationalist party. So it was also about them presenting to the rest of India that they were willing to follow through with their vision of a Hindu Rashtra. So that meant that all states in India would be under this sort of Hindu nationalist vision, including Jammu and Kashmir. So they'd put it on their manifesto prior to the election. So this was seen as something that the BJP felt like they had to follow through on if people were to take them seriously about this, Hindu nationalist ideology that they had been pushing pre-election. And then if we go to the next slide, please. So within places like Israel, we hear about settler colonies, and other Kashmiri writers have discussed this as a form of settler colonialism. But I don't believe that translates very well into Jammu and Kashmir because we don't have the same kind of settler colonial projects as Israel does. So we don't have all these Hindus moving in to Muslim neighborhoods and completely taking over their houses. That hasn't happened. But what we do find is that there are these military colonies, and Jammu and Kashmir was already the most militarized zone in the world, even before 2019. But there's been an increase in troops since then. And with this large amount of military personnel, we now have military enclaves. So it's almost as though we've got these sort of settler colonies as military colonies being set up amongst communities and around the state. So that was certainly something that people were afraid of. And one of the consequences of that is land grabs. So post-annexation, new laws mean that the government can declare any area within Jammu and Kashmir as strategic for military use. So if you had farmland and the government decided that they wanted that farmland because they wanted to set up a military base there, you don't have any choice. You have to give it up. Of course, Articles 370 and 35A protected that from happening previously. So if we go to the next slide. So the loss of economic opportunity and institutional control was a really interesting one because one of the justifications on the part of the BJP ahead of removing the special status was that if they had greater control over Jammu and Kashmir, they would be able to enhance its economy, they'd be able to develop because they'd have greater access to the land, of course, and they'd be able to purchase property. They couldn't do that previously. But actually, what a lot of the people we spoke to were saying is they felt that it would have really negative repercussions. Um, and that was the reality. So unemployment has risen since the abrogation. There have been losses to local businesses. So now that international corporations can come in to Kashmir. They couldn't do that previously because 370 wouldn't allow it. But now international corporations and Indian corporations can come into Kashmir, they can purchase property, they can establish businesses there. And that's had a direct impact on local businesses. It's also pushed the property prices up. So local people, will struggle increasingly to afford housing there as well. So, and also another key consequence is the increase in unemployment. Well, that's because public jobs were only eligible for Kashmiris prior to 2019, and now anybody from India can apply for those jobs. So people in Kashmir are now competing with people from Delhi and Mumbai, people who are, perhaps even more highly qualified than they are. But keeping in mind that we now have a different governance structure, there's an argument to say that actually this is part of a more subtle way of, doing demographic engineering by offering positions to people from India rather than Kashmir. So we'll go on to the next slide. So this is something a little bit complicated, but it does fall within the remit of demographic engineering. One of the things India did within Kashmir quite soon after the abrogation is they said, we need to redraw the electoral boundaries inside of Jammu and Kashmir. And there was a lot of sort of concern about this. What ended up happening is that the Jammu province gained more electoral seats as a result of the redrawing of electoral boundaries. And then, of course, there was an election in 2024. And the BJP won 29 seats in that election. And that's a huge number of seats. And they were won in the Jammu province only, but again, only in certain parts of the Jammu province. So what we saw were these three sort of political camps emerging. So the Kashmir Valley, which of course we didn't think would vote for the BJP. In fact, the BJP didn't have any candidates within the Kashmir Valley at all. We then have, I suppose, what you would call the south of Jammu, which has high pockets of Hindu populations. And then we have what we call the Pahari belt. So Poonch and Rajouri. And depending on which district you're in, they're still Muslim majority areas. And again, they sort of had mixed results. So, of course, people there weren't necessarily wanting to vote for the BJP, but you're seeing these quite distinct political pockets now form within J&K. And the concern around that is that there could eventually become this sort of sectarian divisions or these very sort of cleared sectarian demarcations within the state. And given that there has been violence within some of those areas previously, that's a concern. So if we go to the next slide, please. So, in conclusion, the study unequivocally demonstrates that many of the anxieties and predictions voiced by the participants in Jammu and Kashmir immediately after the abrogation was subsequently validated by actual legal and policy changes implemented by the Indian government. The residency laws, the economic policies, and the boundary changes introduced post-abrogation clearly fall within what Morland described as demographic engineering. So Jammu and Kashmir presents a unique case because Articles 370 and 35A had historically acted as a significant legal impediment to various methods of soft demographic engineering. But their abrogation, therefore, required a complete military occupation to pave the way for the population-altering policies. So just to put this in perspective, the only way that the Indian government were able to abrogate these were by having a complete military occupation in Jammu and Kashmir. It meant that nobody could protest. All political leaders were put in prison. So they had essentially no way, the local population had no way to block the move. They essentially had no choice. So they were put under almost an entire form of house arrest, if you like. And A crucial broader finding of the research emphasizes the powerful role of political narratives. So governments often present specific rationales for drastic measures, which may differ from their true underlying motives. So the BJP, for instance, effectively utilized a vision of a Hindu Rashtra to rally support for the abrogation within India and potentially obscuring its objectives of gaining full economic and strategic control over Jammu and Kashmir. And this underscores that the skillfully crafted political narratives are absolutely key to legitimizing soft forms of demographic engineering in the eyes of the population over which control is sought. So, final slide. In conclusion, the study provides a first-hand account of the predictive insight from the residents of Jammu and Kashmir, demonstrating their profound understanding of how these government policies would lead to irreversible demographic changes and a loss of agency. It underscores that these actions are not isolated events, but are deeply intertwined with India's Hindu nationalist ideology and the long-standing disputed status of Jammu and Kashmir. Ultimately, the case of J&K serves as a powerful illustration of the multifaceted ways that states employ both overt force as well as subtle strategies to gain and maintain control over diverse populations and territories. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Serena. Very nice and very informative. साजिद साहब आप हमारे साथ हैं? Should I stop sharing and so we
जी
can
जी
have questions? Okay, over to you, साजिद साहब. इसको आपने थोड़ा सा चलाना है, फिर हम क्वेश्चन आंसर्स की तरफ चलेंगे. I want कि आप थोड़ा कमेंट करें. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Serena. It was a wonderful presentation. You have highlighted the Indian strategy regarding this demographic engineering. I wanted to add a point in your perspective. Basically, I am not sure about the stay limit, which basically suggested in the new residency permits. But I think so. The 5 to 7 years residency is required in new laws, and you can claim the residency permits. And through that, most of the obviously that was a highly militarized region in the world, and the Indian border security forces had a deep, very large concentration, and at certain point of time there was a more than 700 to 800,000 deployment there, less than a million, but obviously that was a huge number. That was almost equal to 10% of the total population of the Kashmir. And if these border security forces personals are going to allow to receive these residency permits, obviously they had a opposition relationship with the local population. They were in the law enforcement agencies, and they treated local Muslim population as in a hostile relationship. And even the local population resisted the military occupation and military presence of the Kashmir. And obviously, their civil rights, liberties are going to be undermined by these security forces. So, with these kind of the opposition relationship, if these border security forces personnel are allowed to become the citizens of the Kashmir, that is going to create another kind of the demographic rift within Kashmir state. While the new residents are going to compare, obviously, as you have rightly mentioned, the people from Delhi, the people from the more advanced or more developed areas, when they are going to compete with the local population of the Kashmiri, they are going to outclass them in the competition for the jobs. And even they are going to outclass them in local businesses. And these investors and with the support of these immense multinational companies and the local Indian corporations, obviously they are going to create more economic opportunities as well. Obviously, there will be massive infrastructural developments in Kashmir, and they wanted to promote tourism. and they wanted to develop Kashmir. But obviously, the local Kashmiri population had to pay a great cost of that, even economic development to some extent. Obviously, when private investors are going to invest in at certain place, they were in the search of the skilled laborers, and most of the time the Kashmiris are not going to be uh, as educated, as skilled as the market demands. But if they can recruit the people from outside of the Kashmir, obviously they are going to prefer as a private entities. They were largely interested in efficient workers, skilled workers, or the people who are more technology friendly, or they are more educated. So obviously the local Kashmiri populations are largely going to be deprived. And that is going to create another kind of the challenge. The local resources are going to be utilized. Local land is going to be utilized, but for the benefit of these corporations and for the outside investors. And even the local employment opportunities are going to be hijacked by these new residents, or in certain cases the people who are just coming to Kashmir to avail these emerging opportunities. So that is a serious issue for the local Kashmiri population. Obviously, they were living in under certain protections, but unfortunately, due to the prevailing security situation and the resistance from the Kashmiris, and then Indians' military responses to resolve that problem. And that complicated the situation in Kashmir, and Kashmir largely remained deprived from the pace of development which other Indian states had. And the BJP's argument is that they wanted to develop Kashmir on the at par with other Indian union territories. But that is more, I think, as you have rightly highlighted, these dangers and these the soft engineering methodologies are hard techniques, and the cost, you have highlighted the economic cost. I really appreciate your this scientifically conducted research to highlight that problem. So this is from my side. I have agreement with your views and ideas, Dr. Serena.
Thank you. Yeah, those are some really interesting observations. And you're right. So there's sort of the estimate is that there's already about 1.5 million people who are eligible for the domicile certificates, who weren't, who weren't state subjects before. So these are people who had migrated from Pakistan at 47 and beyond, who were Hindu or Sikh or other religions, and they moved into Indian territory. And some of those, of course, even from well, not from J&K because they were state subjects, but from other parts of Pakistan, moved into Indian administered Jammu and Kashmir. They are eligible now for domicile certificates. As you said, military personnel, their children, anyone who attended school in Jammu and Kashmir. So all these people are now eligible for those certificates. And as you said, that's about 10%. It's actually more like 15%. Because J&K, the population is about 10 million. So that's 15% already of the population that has been changed just within these few years. But one of the things that you don't hear about if you're in India is the militancy. The militancy hasn't stopped. So the Indian media, of course, we know that Belgaum happened, and whenever any kind of terrorist attack happens in Kashmir, immediately Pakistan is blamed. What they don't tell you is that there is still indigenous militant activity by the people of Jammu and Kashmir taking place in Jammu and Kashmir. So it's still there. People are still finding ways to protest what's happened. And there are still these acts of opposition, these violent acts of opposition. But it's not within India's narrative to admit that those are still happening. So I see some hands up. So we have Abbas, Kareem, I think. And sorry.
Okay, Inayat, please ask the question. Then Abbas will answer.
First of all, thanks to Dr. Serena. And my question is that you had mentioned that Pakistan too has allowed people to live there, and they allowed them to buy lands and give them permits. The same case has been done on the side of India. So how have the people of Kashmir responded to both the sides? Was it welcoming from Pakistan, or was it welcoming from India? And why then the difference? If Kashmir is to be a separate and an independent state. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so just to say that whole, what was the erstwhile princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which of course includes Gilgit-Baltistan, Ladakh, Azad Kashmir, and the Indian side of Jammu and Kashmir, that whole area was protected by the state subject rule in 47. So you could not buy property, you could not have a civil service position, you could not be part of the local politics unless you were from the Riyasat. So as an outsider from Lahore, from Delhi, you were not allowed to purchase property, to have a government position, etc., etc. The first part of that state to have that change was Gilgit-Baltistan. That happened before this happened in 2019. And now effectively the only part of the erstwhile state that still has that protection upheld is Azad Kashmir. So Azad Kashmir is still the only place where if you are from the Riyasat, if you are a descendant from 1947, for 2 generations, they still refer to it as the state subject, that you are allowed to purchase property and own property and have a legitimate domicile, sort of legal status. So that was eroded in GB. And I don't want to sort of talk about GB too much because I haven't done enough research there, but I do know people who have, and I visited GB. And certainly I think most of you will be familiar that there was some sectarian violence within Gilgit-Baltistan. So we know that happened. So this was, of course, around that time. There were changes in populations. There have been some disputes around the dams as well, hydropower projects that are, some are saying no, that hydropower project is actually in Gilgit-Baltistan, but because it borders with the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, they're saying no, it belongs to the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So there's certainly been tensions around that there. The difference is, I think the key difference here is that Gilgit-Baltistan from the very offset accepted, the leaders of Gilgit-Baltistan from the offset in 47 accepted Jinnah's proposal. This is the key difference. So in theory, GB didn't have an issue of becoming a fully integrated province within Pakistan at that time. I guess that's the key difference. On the other side, Sheikh Abdullah, who was then in charge, Sheikh Abdullah and his national conference did not want to be part of Pakistan. He very clearly aligned with Nehru. So if we're to look at these two territories and think about what their political history is and whether they would have opposition to having that special status removed, arguably you could say, well, historically, if Gilgit-Baltistan actually wanted to be part of Pakistan and had made that clear, then would they feel as aggrieved about having that special status revoked or not? I think that's a debate that has happened, continues to happen in GB around whether it should have been a fully fledged province or not. I think what's clear is that in Jammu and Kashmir, they didn't want to be a fully fledged province or a union territory of India. That was absolutely not on the cards for them at any point. So they've got a slightly different history.
Yes, Abbas, please ask the question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Serena, for such a wonderful presentation. So you talked about demographic engineering, and basically there went a lot of violence into it. You talked about the massacre, and when there was any sort of unpopular law introduced by the Indian authorities back then, the response from the local people obviously were to come out on streets and roads, and they obviously were met with violence by the Indian authorities. So you talked about Israel and India. These are two different occupying forces, but I think what has happened in Kashmir are not lesser than what has happened in Palestine back then. However, in my opinion, after Kargil war, we have sort of downplayed, I think both the countries have downplayed the issue of Kashmir just because we both countries believe that we're complicit in our own ways. And do you believe that just because of this sort of construction, the international media or the international like countries throughout the world, they're also not giving us a lot of attention, keeping in view that Kashmir is a genuine issue and there are innocent people who are suffering over here. So what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I thought about this because when it happened, when the abrogation happened, and of course there was a complete communication blackout. So that in itself was very evidently a violation of human rights because demographically elected politicians had been put in prison. So these were very clear violations of human rights. But the international community remained silent. They absolutely didn't get involved. And I think that's in part because the UN declared that this was a bilateral issue, and this was something that had to be resolved between India and Pakistan themselves. And of course, Imran Khan at the time was very vocal about what was happening, and he took it to the UN, Security Council, and he was very publicly, vocal about the fact that this shouldn't have happened and that it was in breach of the agreement. But I mean, there certainly didn't seem to be any appetite on the part of the international community to get involved. But when I recently spoke to a Kashmiri lawyer about this, he said the international community aren't obliged to get involved. They're not obliged to get involved. And I think that's partly because, as I said, this was seen as a bilateral issue for such a long time. Now, very recently that changed because there was a war. And, just a few months ago, we were on the brink of a nuclear war. And then America did have to get involved, and it stopped that war. But the war was over an incident that happened in Kashmir. So again, we see how this keeps coming back to Kashmir and what's playing out in Kashmir. And India, kept insisting that it was Pakistan who were behind that terrorist attack. Pakistan kept saying it wasn't. We had no appetite for this at this moment. We have our own internal domestic issues. We cannot, we do not want to get involved in a war right now, but you've left us no choice. I think that was a point that the international community stepped in, but not because it cares about Kashmir or Kashmiris, but because it cares about the stability of the region, and it's in nobody's interest for India and Pakistan to, progress in their aggression any further because they both have, a similar number of military weapons. And I mean, it kind of shows the misunderstanding of the whole Kashmir issue, because Trump said that India and Pakistan had been fighting for, what did he say, hundreds of years, thousands of years? I don't know how long he said. I mean, Pakistan has only existed for like 70 something years. But, I mean, it kind of gives you an understanding of, I think, what the international community think about the issue. It's not a priority for them. I think they see it as a domestic issue for India. They see it as, this bone of contention between India and Pakistan. And when it sort of crosses over to becoming potentially very dangerous for the region, I think then they step in. But from what I've been able to see, just in terms of funding on the project, interest in the project, the international community doesn't seem to care very much. I mean, it will, human rights organizations do still comment on it. There are still fact-finding missions. But that's just like with any other territory in the world where we know that human rights abuses are happening.
Thank you, Dr. Serena. Dr. Serena, I had a question. What kind of emotional or psychological impact have these events had on the people living there? Could you capture this aspect in your study, or could you feel I want you to share?
Absolutely. I mean, I didn't really talk about that here, but to be honest, because you know, I was one of the first people, or these two researchers on the ground, we were one of the first people because we did the interviews within the first 6 weeks of the abrogation happening. So we were one of the first kind of people that those participants were actually having an open conversation with about this, other than their immediate family or friends. So there was definitely a lot of trauma and a lot of sharing of trauma and many stories. I mean, there were so many stories of what happened at that time. You know, there were stories, for example, you know, one of the, he said, I woke up in the middle of the night, there were announcements, I looked out my window, there were, you know, all these sort of military personnel that we hadn't seen before. Our local police didn't have guns anymore, so they took the weapons from the local Jammu Kashmir police in case they also retaliated against the military. And then they weren't allowed to leave their homes. So, you know, he was saying that his father's diabetic, but he wasn't allowed to leave to get medication for his father. They weren't allowed to even go to their neighbor's house. They couldn't gather on the streets. If they saw two people on the streets, you know, the military would come and intervene. There was no chance of any kind of protest at all. It just wasn't possible. The few people who tried were immediately taken to prisons. And one of the things they did is they would take them to prisons in India. So once somebody had been picked up on the street for protesting or saying or doing something, they'd be picked up immediately and no one knew where they were. They'd left the state. So, you know, I mean, this was terrifying. People didn't want to take that risk. They didn't know where they were going to end up. So yeah, the emotional toll was really really evident. And depending on where you were, there was more or less military. For the first few weeks, there was military everywhere, including in Jammu, including in the Hindu neighborhoods. There was military everywhere. Because I think the Indian government didn't know whether even Hindu residents of Jammu and Kashmir would protest. You know, they didn't know how anyone was going to take it because it wasn't done with anybody's consent. So, you know, they'd kind of measure the opinion of people, they'd see how people were behaving, and then they'd slowly sort of back off and let them have a little bit more freedom. And the people in some districts in Jammu got their phone connectivity back sooner. It was off in Kashmir for a very long time, for months. So, yeah. But for everybody, when it first happened, it was very traumatic because nobody could leave the house.
Thank you very much. Dr. Serena, we have a couple of questions in chat box. Let me read that. Okay, how India, Dr. Iram is asking how India justifies its narrative of Jammu and Kashmir as its part with the presence of such a high military concentration there. This is the first question. And the second one, does the concept of Akhand Bharat really exist historically?
How does it justify its narrative of that military presence? I mean, I suppose now what it's saying is that it's there to keep the people of Jammu and Kashmir safe from militants from Pakistan. I mean, this is one of the ways they justify it, because it's not in their interest to say that these militants are local. Of course, you know, if the Indian public think, oh my God, people in Jammu and Kashmir are, committing these acts, well, they're certainly not going to go and visit there. They're certainly not going to want to move there. And actually, a lot of people who've been given their domicile certificates haven't moved, even though they're eligible for them. They haven't relocated to Jammu and Kashmir because they know that it is still a live conflict zone, because it is still a live conflict zone. And that's how they can justify the military presence. That it's there ultimately to protect the citizens of Jammu and Kashmir. But of course, we know that, and protect them from who? Well, protect them from Pakistan, protect them from any kind of rogue players within the state, protect them from the misguided youth who might be radicalized, these kinds of narratives.
Thank you, Dr. Serena. Dr. Serena, I was thinking that what was the inspiration behind this idea when you worked on it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd kind of been looking at Jane. So I work for a Peace and Conflict Studies Center, and I'd been looking at J&K on and off, mainly Azad Kashmir. I'd done some work on some workshops with young people from Gaza, Palestine, Azad Kashmir, Indian occupied Kashmir. And I'd sort of been working on this slowly, and then I decided to write a book, publish a book on Jammu and Kashmir called Society and Politics of Jammu and Kashmir. And one of the things that we believed is that it's impossible to abrogate these articles. It was impossible to abrogate them because they're the only link that India has with Jammu and Kashmir. If you abrogate them, India has no link with it anymore. This wasn't India's to give. These articles were based on international treaties. So when they were abrogated, I think everybody was just in complete shock. And I was really interested to know how people on the ground were experiencing what was happening because we couldn't hear from them. So yeah, I just got very lucky, I suppose, in that I had contacts out there who were able to do some of the data collection for me. And then that I was able to speak to other people myself as well. And it kind of just snowballed into, speaking to more than 50 people. And
Great.
yeah.
Inayat, do you have any other question? Inayat. Abbas, you can ask the question. Then we will give the mic to Sadisa to contribute.
Dr. Serena, I'm going to ask a question that might sound such a cliche, but I still have to sort of get your opinion about this. So when we sort of talk about Kashmir issue, it seems that something that's in the air, and I don't speak dismissively of it. I'm of great caution about this issue, and it's of great importance to everyone, I think, to every human being. But it seems that Kashmir issue is something that we most of the time deal with in academia, or something that's part of the storytelling, like novels and stuff of that sort. Because as you mentioned, that international organizations, they don't want to play the middleman in it, right? Because they say that it's a bilateral issue and Pakistan, India should solve it in between. However, as far as these two countries are concerned, they've fought, I think, 4 or 5 wars on the same thing. And whenever there is sort of diplomatic efforts, there is still some sort of difference, even within these countries, especially Pakistan. Like, for example, there are instances where politicians wanted to solve it through dialogues, through diplomacy, but it didn't go well because the military were not in favor of it. So, like, I'm sort of curious, what would you suggest? How can we go about this issue?
So I think when it first happened, and I was in Pakistan last year, and I was kind of doing a lectures tour, and various people academics would come up to me and say, oh, and government officials would say, it's a shame, but I think we've probably accepted that this is just the way it is. We've got Azad Kashmir and GB, and they've got Ladakh and, their side. And that's how it is. And we can't really do very much about it now. I think there's possibly some truth to that. So the way forward, I think for the people of the state, so I keep talking about a bilateral approach. It should have been a trilateral approach, because within this entire time, nobody asked the people from the Riyasat what they wanted. It was just India and Pakistan and what they wanted. And that has been a disaster. We've seen what's happened. We were nearly, we were about to nuke India and Pakistan. We're about to nuke each other. It hasn't gone away. I think so I'm originally from Azad Kashmir, and I know Azad Kashmir, we've got our own movement going on right now with the Joint Awami Action Committee. I mean, that's another story, but I think the point is the people from the state haven't let go of these issues. And whether that's militant attacks on that side or protests on our side, both countries can think that this is being dampened down, but actually there's too much at stake. Economically, there's too much at stake. I mean, this is really about the resources and the water. So whoever controls the territory controls the water. So this is it's not about whether you care about people in Kashmir or not. It's about access to water and resources and hydropower projects. So without the buy-in of the people, you're never really going to have full control. And I think one of the ways, and in an ideal world, you would make this a trilateral, and you would bring those people to the table, and you would develop an amicable agreement with the rightful owners of that land on who gets access to what. And I think if it was fair and equitable, actually, I think it could be worked out quite well. Instead, we've got two countries who are fighting over the resources. And I think that'll continue. I think it'll continue. We've seen it's continued just this year. It's not
Thank you
going
so much
away.
for such an insightful answer.
Yes, Afzal sir, you can ask the question now. Afzal sir, unmute please.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum
Beautifully
assalam.
presented topic. And my question is, why did international community remain silent on the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A? Because Kashmir was an autonomous region, autonomous state under the supervision and under the eye of international establishment for more than 70 years. Were there any vested interests of international establishment?
No, there wasn't. And the only kind of exposure this really got in the West was through the diaspora. So we saw people in the US, Kashmiris in the US opposing this. We saw parliamentarians in the UK who have constituents who are from the Kashmiri diaspora speaking to this, but no. And to say why is that? I think partly because, like I said, this was sort of presented as a bilateral, and people, and other nations don't really want to get involved between India and Pakistan in that way unless they absolutely have to. I think it's also partly maybe apathy. I mean, what we're seeing in Gaza, there's clearly a genocide and full starvation program happening. And who is intervening? Who's intervening? Which state has actually intervened? So is it that actually international organizations just simply cannot do anything? I mean, this is another question that we have to ask ourselves. Has the concept of human rights become redundant? I mean, this is a general question that we need to ask. I think in the light of Gaza, I think we can, it's quite plausible to say that international organizations have basically lost their ability to do anything about anything, really.
Thank you, Dr.
Was there any impact of Shimla Treaty on it?
No, I mean, as we've seen, that's been one of the threats, hasn't it, from India, that they would essentially that they've tore that up, and that they were threatening essentially to not maintain their agreements regarding the water treaties. I mean, there've been floods in Pakistan now, and I know at the time Pakistan said, if they did that, if they were to release the water into Pakistani territory, that Pakistan would see that as an act of aggression and that they would go to war over that. They were very clear about it. But it is a threat. India keeps threatening Pakistan with that. I think they wouldn't be foolish enough to do it, but who knows?
Thank you. Yes,
Thank you very much.
Sajid sir, I want you to. Sajid sir.
Thank you, Shmela, for again providing the opportunity to further add on this issue. As Dr. Sina have highlighted, that the recent elections and the electoral gerrymandering of the Kashmir state is going to be happened. Obviously, that is going to affect the Kashmiris' articulation of interest to some extent. When the central political forces are going to develop inroads in the Kashmir's internal politics, obviously they are working on central political agenda, and they are largely going to articulate the Indians' overall general interest. And these central political forces, obviously previously there were local political forces, like Sheikh Abdullah's party was there, Mahbooba Mufti's party was there, and then there were some other groups who never participated in electoral arena, and they remained as a effective pressure group. But through these demographic engineerings, not only the electoral constituencies are going to be redrawn, that is going to radically transform the electoral and political landscape of the Kashmir state. And the active participation or the active control of the central political forces, whether that is going to be BJP or whether that is going to be Indian National Congress, that is going to undermine the local political representation, and that is going to sideline the local political interests as well. When local political parties are going to operate, obviously they have to uh, link themselves with the local issues and local problems. And in that case, as the electoral dynamics suggested in case of Pakistan and India, in both cases, monetization entered in. People with a lot of wealth, they can invest in the constituencies and they can easily find ways to get themselves elected. And obviously, then they have the political commitments with the central political forces. Maybe they are politically rooted and at certain other place, but they are going to operate as the people's representative of the Kashmir. Then they are not going to articulate or represent the Kashmiri's problems and Kashmiri's issues. And in long term, that is going to undermine the Kashmir case in another context. No doubt, in recent past, basically especially in post 9/11 scenario, the Muslim militancy was going to be branded, and India had a great advantage of that situation. Obviously, Pakistan had to withdraw the all the backing or the support available to these militant groups. And militancy as a strategy was going to be a face of great backlash from international friends. And ultimately, we have to impose ban in political and military militant leadership was going to be arrested in Pakistan. And India successfully pleaded the Muslim militancy case in Kashmir as a case of terrorism. They linked that episode with the terrorism. But unfortunately, the Kashmiris' right to resistance or their right of self-determination is going to be undermined. As Dr. Serena have rightly pointed out that what is going to happen in Palestine, that is an eye-opener for all of us. No international laws, no international values, no international institutions are going to be respected. The sheer use of force, and they are committing genocide, and they are using and they are violating every kind of human rights in every manner. But there were public protests, no doubt, in Western capitals, but no political government of the Western capital wanted to actually oppose that. They are maintaining public face. So same was the case with the Kashmir issue on international global political front, and we must realize that situation. In post 9/11 scenario, Pakistan largely and Kashmiris largely lost their case due to the question of terrorism and militancy. Now, the political struggle is facing another kind of a challenge. Obviously, there are economic incentives are there. Even there are certain political players in the Kashmir who pleaded that these mainstreaming is going to create economic opportunities, and they may be bribed. They may be obviously central political forces and central political parties have enough resources to invest in the Kashmir, but in most of the cases, state is not going to invest. These private businessmen are going to invest, and they were largely interested in minting money. They are going to use the potential of the Kashmir for the benefit. Obviously, they are going to use the resources, the land, the opportunities which are available in the Kashmir state. So, unfortunately, the Kashmiris have no hopes in near future. India successfully managed, and India largely absorbed the when they changed that status. We accept it or not accept, that is not going to be issue. But India largely absorbed that episode. Post 2019, India remained successful in managing the Kashmir issue, And obviously, there was no wave of militancy, and militancy can't sustain without the outside sustainable support, and no
Well,
outside.
yeah, I mean, you're saying that, but there have been militant attacks and they've moved. So they've moved from primarily being in the Kashmir province to the Jammu province in the Bir Panjal. I mean, I think that was the longest standoff in history just after the abrogation. I mean, it went on for, I think, nearly 2 weeks. The military couldn't find the militants because they were in the Bir Panjal. Still happening. I think to say that there isn't local militancy or there isn't that sort of level of local protest on that level is just really naive. And of course, like I keep saying, it doesn't serve India's narrative. In a way, you're right, but I think, perhaps a more sort of holistic way to view this is that the Muslims in India, since the BJP and the far-right rise, have been struggling. The Muslims in Kashmir were protected against that because of their special status. Now they are in the same category as the rest of the Muslims in India. So I think in many ways their future will be quite similar, actually. And this is, for how long will there be a far-right Hindu nationalist government in India? We don't know. But for the time that it's there, I think that the prospects of Muslims within India, be it J&K or the rest of India, are very bleak.
But
Thank you,
these
Dr.
structural
Serena.
changes are going to sustain, Dr. Serena. The
So the
demographic
demographic, yeah,
engineers you have rightly mentioned,
may
these
or
issues are going to
may
sustain in
may or
Kashmir.
may not, may or may not, because people are hesitant to relocate there. They've got their certificates, but they're not really moving there because it's unstable in terms of conflict. So people are hesitant. Now, if we think about the military, well, if things changed and that military personnel left, then there would be less military in Kashmir. So in some ways it could potentially improve, but we don't know. We don't know what the future holds.
Sajid,
A
I
lot
think
of it depends. A lot of it depends on how the politics in India itself plays out. Whether this is just a wave of far-right political movement and it'll sort of die down and then we'll see a more kind of leftist political
But
mood.
credit goes to Kashmiris. They continuously resisted and they maintain their
Yes,
spirits for right of
yes,
self-determination. We must
yes,
salute them. We must appreciate their
absolutely.
continuous struggle against the powerful force. But we have to revisit our strategy. Our old Pakistan's advocacy of Kashmir issue in old fashion is not going to serve the
No,
cause. Uh,
no. And sorry to interrupt because I'm short on time.
yeah.
We are already revisiting that. I don't know if you know what's happening in Azad Kashmir. Are you aware of what's happening in Azad Kashmir with the Joint Awami Action Committee? It is being
yes,
revisited, but it's being revisited from Azad Kashmir, who have now said, you haven't managed to resolve this. We want to change the dynamics. We want to change the power relations between Azad Kashmir and Islamabad. And one thing I will say is it's not just hats off to the people of Kashmir for their resistance. The diaspora who are from Azad Kashmir kept this struggle alive constantly. The Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front was created in Birmingham, not in Srinagar. It was in the UK. So the diaspora have also kept it alive. They've been, it's been a two-prong approach. I think in Azad Kashmir, when the abrogation happened, I think people within Azad Kashmir, that leadership within Azad Kashmir, sort of the organic leadership within Azad Kashmir started to emerge again because it wasn't available in the valley anymore. So either they took hold of it or nobody would. And the great thing about that happening is there wasn't a big diaspora from the Indian side of Kashmir. There's a huge diaspora from Azad Kashmir. So the Joint Awami Action Committee are working with the diaspora in the UK. In fact, they've got an event in Birmingham. I think one of the senior members is coming to Birmingham next week. And they're demonstrating here. So I think the activism has shifted from the valley, where it's not possible anymore, to Azad Kashmir. I think the militancy has started to shift from the valley to the Jammu province in India. Hasn't gone away. I think that's the key thing. I don't think it's gone away. I don't think anybody's going to be particularly happy about this for the next 20, 30 years. The political landscape in India may change in the meantime, and there may be some gains, I think, from that. But for now, I agree, it's very bleak. I agree, it's bleak. And Pakistan's strategy, you know, I have my own personal opinions about that. I think they were a bit foolish, actually, in the way that they operated here. They lost favor with the Muslims in Jammu. They lost favor with their own Kashmiris in Azad Kashmir. And they focused entirely on the Kashmir Valley. And that was to their detriment. They missed a very important trick, I think. But anyway, it's happened now. It's happened now. I mean, it is what it is.
Thank you, Dr. Serena, for sharing your insights and your time. We really appreciate your insight. Thank you, Dr. Sajid Saab, for contributing. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. We will leave the session here because Dr. Serena has some other commitments. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much. Thank
It
you.
was a wonderful talk, Dr. Serena.
It was wonderful.
Really
It was
appreciate.
comprehensive, interesting, and wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Allah
Thank
Hafiz.
you. Allah Hafiz.
Hafiz.